Right after I had finished recording it, they went and updated the patch notes from today's dev stream to include all of the uniques and all of the aspects and the glyphs coming to season 2, whereas previously they only had about half of them and they didn't have the glyphs. So what I want to do is give a very quick breakdown of all of the generic options that are available for every single class, and then go into specific detail for the Necromancer unique aspects and glyphs to give you an idea of what my expectations are for these items without necessarily seeing all the stats, but at least just the unique effects on them. So I hope that this is able to contextualize these items, give you a bit more understanding of where they might fit into the meta as we currently understand it, and what I'm personally excited about. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First item here is Tassets of the Dawning Sky. Without knowing anything else, it basically says you're able to choose to increase your maximum resistance against a particular damage type. These almost certainly will only be used against the new endgame bosses, who they've told us time and time again we're going to need to be able to specialize in particular resistances to reduce their incoming damage. I don't see these being used in general play outside of that, unless they're pants that say all resistance, which is something that a lot of classes might need to be able to actually reach cap. The Blood Moon Breeches right here, the Necromancer unique pants, so I guess we're not using those generic pants up there, have an incredibly interesting thing attached to them that I can't quite figure out how it's supposed to be implemented, and then something that just seems really good for overpower builds. So the first part says, your minions have up to a 7% chance to curse an enemy. Now, that could mean a lot. What the cool part about this is if it could automate applying the cursed effect to a target, so not specifically Iron Maiden, not specifically Decrepify, but the target is just considered to be cursed, it means that we can use the passive Amplify damage without needing to cast Curse ourselves, as well as use the Amplify glyph to give the curse status and that additional damage multiplier. Now that's kind of cool. It will allow you to run minions, but still get some of the bonuses from having the cursed effect. Now that being said, just about every single Necromancer build wants to proactively cast a cursed. So the second part here, which says that enemies affected by at least one type of curse, so any curse or the cursed effect. Also, I need to look into whether or not the vampiric curse from season 2 counts as the cursed status for the purposes of these pants. I think it will, but that's just interesting to think about. They're going to take an additional 1.7 times multiplier of overpower damage. So I don't even need the minions part of it. I can just choose to apply Decrepify to the target and then gain the access of this additional multiplier, meaning that all of a sudden my pants can give me a damage multiplier that rivals a lot of the other damage multiplying aspects that we have available on the kit. So that's pretty cool. It really depends though. I don't understand how the minion part is supposed to work into it. Maybe it casts your curse, maybe it casts a random curse. It's hard to say. The automation part right there is at least interesting, and I don't hate the fact that it offers an interesting build niche that may not necessarily be the best, but is something that you can do, because a lot of people just like playing lazy builds, and if it's like, oh yeah, sure, I don't get the Decrepify ability, but at least they take extra damage, some people are willing to play that way, and I think all power to them. This also heavily points to a minion-based blood build, which I'm definitely going to have to theory craft. They put in so much stuff to make minions just better for overpower builds in general, and you're not necessarily as tied to having to sacrifice everything on a blood build, which is something that you kind of had to previously do, no question. So at least for right now, that's kind of interesting. I do think that even if these pants only have like maximum life and then a couple defensive stats on them, bare minimum, they're just like great for overpower builds, and you'll probably see me testing these out. Godslayer Crown is really interesting. If you would stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy, or hit a boss with damage, it pulls in nearby enemies. You then deal a multiplicative damage bonus to them. The them here, I think, is referring to the nearby enemies that are not the elite or the boss. And you do that damage bonus for 3 seconds, and then it can only occur once every 12 seconds. Very, very interesting. The fact that it's called a Godslayer Crown, though, leads me to believe that the wording here is kind of mislabeled or misrepresentative, and you also get the damage bonus against the elite or the boss. That's just not what it currently reads like. So let's assume you don't get the bonus on the elite or the boss. I think that this piece of gear is absolutely trash. If it gives you a damage bonus against the boss and the elite as well, it's again another really interesting unique that allows you to take a damage multiplier that you normally wouldn't get on a helmet slot and put that onto any build. Now, bone builds on the Necromancer already have Deathless Visage, but none of the other builds really have a helmet with damage potential on it. Similarly, Druid builds are probably going to try to use Tempest Roar, but if you're not using Tempest Roar, again, you didn't really have a helmet with damage options on it. All of a sudden we do in this, so it leads me to believe that there's a world within which this thing is used for hyper efficient density farming or speed farming, especially super farming through nightmare dungeons very quickly, if it actually increases your damage against the boss. Flickerstep are boots that anybody can wear that I think are literally too powerful, and let me walk you through. It says each enemy that you evade through reduces your active cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds up to 10 seconds. So that means that if you have a max roll on it and you evade through a group of monsters as you're engaging with them or before you kill them, etc., you're reducing the active cooldown of your ultimate by 10 seconds just by hitting 3 monsters with it. Even if it's just evading through a boss monster in between casts of spells, it's every single time you do it, it's 4 seconds. That seems absolutely ridiculous. Most notably the Infinimus build that wants to have Bone Storm up 100% of the time. You saw all of these Bone Spear builds trying to use Lidless Wall to maintain Bone Storm 100% of the time, to get the added crit chance and the damage reduction and the barrier generation, etc. It's kind of disgusting just how powerful an ultimate skill can be if you're able to spam it all of the time. And just to very quickly go back to the dev stream where they actually highlighted these boots, there's something interesting to notice, which was kind of my fear, which is that the implicit on it is that your attacks reduce your evade's cooldown rather than maximum evade charges. So you're not able to very quickly spam this, you got to attack in between. Now, luckily, the boots already have movement speed on them. They also have all stats, which is going to become more important. All stats, increasing your main stat, increases the base skill damage, which you're going to need to offset all of the loss of multiplicative damage. That's a whole other video. But then they also have ultimate skill damage, something boots have never had before, and then damage reduction from close, because you're going to have to evade through monsters. I think the item affixes are very smartly presented here. It definitely makes sense to me. And I definitely believe that there is a world where either a Blood Wave or a Bone Storm Necromancer is going to be trying these out to get truly 100% uptime, that with Ozius Gale, and then cooldown reduction from Blood Orbs with Fast Blood. I think there's a world here where we finally have like an ultimate spamming Necromancer build as opposed to a pseudo ultimate spamming version of it. Tibault's Will are pants that anybody can wear, and they say that you deal an additional 40% damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. When you become unstoppable, gain 50% of your primary resource. Now, the reason why this is so interesting is for builds that can just spam unstoppable all the time seems really good. Pants that again are giving you a damage bonus as well as resource just for gaining the unstoppable effect is pretty nutty. It's even more potent in season 2, where you can have the metamorphosis vampire power that says that every time that you evade, you become unstoppable for 4 seconds. Add on to that, you can use the Ghost Walker aspect on your boots that say when you gain unstoppable and for 3 seconds after, gain 25% movement speed. And you have a really nice combination of things here where I'm gaining unstoppable, meaning I'm just generally safer. I'm triggering anything that says unstoppable in my skill tree. I'm gaining resource so I can spam my skills. I'm gaining movement speed from Ghost Walker, and now I'm gaining damage from my pants. That combination right there on a lot of builds I think is going to be incredibly powerful. And unless, again, these pants say like absolutely garbage tier defensive stats, you're going to see these on a lot of different builds. Zafal's Corroded Signet is a unique ring that anybody can wear with a unique lucky hit ability, saying that your damage over time effects have up to a 50% chance to erupt, dealing a 5 to 6 modifier damage of the same type to nearby enemies. The reason why this is so important is because typically with things like these, the damage that they do is coded in some way. It's either physical damage or poison damage or whatever. This says that your damage over time abilities are going to do the damage of your damage over time abilities, meaning that they're going to scale with your build and any additive or multiplicative bonuses that you have for those damage types. Now, the problem with putting anything onto a ring or an amulet is that these slots are incredibly powerful. Your ring is where you can put resource, your amulet is where you can get your 50% bonus to whatever damage aspect you want to put on there. So the stats on the ring are going to have to be pretty ubiquitously good to see a lot of use across the board for damage over time builds. But I can definitely see this piece of gear being used on an Infinimus build or any of the shadow damage builds, just to be able to get an additional opportunity for all of them to be proccing damage, which would then go on to proc things like Shadow Blight, since that only looks at shadow damage being applied and not a particular skill applying it. But yeah, having a huge amount of lucky hit chance on my build, I think on my Infinimus build, I had upwards of like 70 lucky hit chance. Taking that, multiplying 50% by an additional 70% there, so you're getting an 85% lucky hit chance that this thing will just go off and deal an additional amount of AoE damage. Seems really strong. The stats on the ring are going to have to be really dog water for us to not consider running this on the majority of shadow builds. Soulbrand, the chest armor piece, has an incredibly interesting unique effect here, which says that your healing potions no longer have the instantaneous heal portion of them, but instead grant you barrier of 200% of that healing for 4 seconds. And then after says that while you have barrier up, you gain up to 20% damage reduction. So your potion will no longer heal you for the instant part. It will still heal you over time. Spamming it can be used to consistently generate barrier. You're going to gain 200% of the barrier of the healing that you would get. So you're literally regaining more effective hit points than what you would have gained with the potion itself. And then you're gaining 20% damage reduction, something that's going to be so important walking into season 2, since armor has become less effective at reducing total incoming damage. And we're going to have to be juggling resistances as well. Now, I don't think that this item is an auto include across the board, but what's also very interesting to consider the fact is that you can gain abilities and stats that say increase the amount of healing that you receive. So by increasing the amount of healing that we receive, you would increase the amount that the potion would have healed by, which gives you double that as barrier. This is going to very consistently be able to generate barrier for a build that needs it, while not necessarily being able to bring you back up to healthy status or back up to full life, which is something that you might also need for your build. Last but not least, we have the Banished Lord's Talisman. It is a unique amulet, and what this says is that after you spend 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. And then, interestingly enough, if you haven't watched my video covering the changes to overpower, crit, and vulnerable, I would recommend it. But one of the things I touched on there was the fact that overpower builds are now going to be able to benefit from critical strike damage and critical strike chance to a much larger degree than they could previously. The next part says that your critical strikes that overpower deal bonus multiplicative damage. So now you're heavily incentivized to have an overpower build that also successfully crits a lot of the time, because this doesn't say that your guaranteed overpower core skill needs to go off. It just says your critical strikes that also overpower can gain up to a 2.2 times damage multiplier. And that's nutty. This is finally an aspect that is powerful enough that you wouldn't feel bad replacing an aspect on your amulet with it because of the raw amount of power that you get out of it. Similarly, since it's something that modifies your base overpower and crit damage relationship while also giving you another avenue of guaranteeing overpower, this adds on to the total kit for most blood builds that I think at this point are going to be drastically overperforming any of our wildest expectations, because this amulet would have to have literally no stats on it for affixes for me to not run it on every single overpower build. Now that we've gone through the uniques, let's look at the aspects. I'll try to be a little bit faster here just because these ones should have a lower total impact across the board. Aspect of Slaughter says that you have movement speed as long as you don't take damage. So for builds that don't take damage, like Bone Spear at max range, or Infinimus, which is in Blood Mist all the time, you just have 20% movement speed. Now that being said, on something like Infinimus, Ghost Walker ends up being a lot stronger just because it stays on after and even if you do take damage. And then on something like a Bone Spear build, while it's strictly stronger than Wind Striker, you don't lose it for an amount of time when you take damage, whereas on Wind Striker, as long as I'm hitting a target, I have 16% additional movement speed since I'm going to be able to crit 100% of the time. So I definitely think that there's a world where this aspect is slept on and undervalued, but I can understand a lot of different situations depending on your build where not having near permanent uptime on mobility ends up being more of a hindrance than not. Aspect of Elements is bad. I could spend a lot of time going over it. I can't imagine a build that like legitimately does this thing other than maybe a sorceress that's using multiple damage types, or is using the new Paragon node that says that you gain multiplicative damage equal to your additive damage bonuses. So sometimes it has 60 additive damage from fire and lightning, sometimes it has 30. it's very, very cool concept. I think that this implementation of it makes it effectively useless for the vast majority of builds. Aspect of Long Shadow is a very interesting aspect. It asks the question, do shadow builds need to be able to generate more essence with more caveats to how they can do it? So it's a lucky hit chance, your shadow damage over time effects, which basically means it can only trigger once per shadow damage over time effect that you have on them. So one corpse explosion can only trigger this one time, and that's a lucky hit chance to generate 3 essence. I already generate more essence than that just by consuming a corpse. So already it's not even performing as well as like a basic passive in my skill tree. The cool part about it is that it says when Shadow Blight procs, you regain 2 essence. So a lot of these builds are able to proc Shadow Blight very often. So being able to like passively generate maybe 2 more essence per second isn't terrible. The issue being that you already have Exposed Flesh, which just says if you hit a vulnerable target, lucky hit chance 10%, not tied to a specific damage type or skill type, regain 50 essence. So it has to outperform that, and I just don't think that it does. Moving on to the glyphs, we have some really interesting additions to the Necromancer that allow us to build in more specific ways. The first one, Exhumation, which is what I'm pretty sure that's pronounced as, because it's exhume, so it's exhumation. Says that it's an intelligence glyph, and then for every intelligence within range, you can gain up to 13.9 bonus corpse skill damage. So that is corpse tendrils and corpse explosion. With a 75 intelligence node, that's giving us 15 times multiplier of 14 effectively. So it ends up being 210% additive corpse skill damage, which is already pretty huge. There's a build that is pseudo functional right now without the changes to Black River. That's a pure blighted corpse explosion build. It works. It kind of does okay. Its major issue is the fact that it can't crit, which is drastically reduced in effectiveness now. It could only really gain from vulnerable damage, and also like the skills don't really add up for you to be able to do a lot more with it other than that. The interesting part here, and this may just be used for its additional bonus, is that consuming a corpse will fortify you for 4% of your maximum life and grant you 4% damage reduction for 4 seconds. The cool part about that is that a lot of Necromancer builds are really starved for the ability to generate Fortify. You would often use Blood Drinker and swap Corpse Tendrils over to generating Blood Orbs just to be able to fortify on some builds that didn't need Vulnerable, just to give an idea of like how deep we would change our builds just to be able to successfully fortify. And if this thing says at the end of a fight, I can just clear the room by casting Corpse Explosion and then gain myself maximum Fortify and also walk into the next fight with some damage reduction, that's kind of good enough. I think that this will definitely see a lot of use on shadow damage builds, shadow blight builds, etc. I'm interested to see how much it shifts back over to actually doing shadow damage over time, as opposed to what we were doing previously, which was fully building into crit invuln for the shadow blight procs. Well, because crit damage is drastically under powerful at this point, so being able to build into that just to be able to proc it sometimes probably isn't going to get the same returns as just fully investing in shadow damage and damage over time. Desecration is similarly interesting in that it's a willpower node, so the best willpower node that you can get is about 49 willpower, and it says that your desecrated ground deals bonus damage. I think Desecrated Ground refers to any instance of leaving our shadow damage on the ground, so via Blighted Corpse Explosion and via Blight itself. Desecrated Ground isn't really a keyword that we've had before, but we know that these new glyphs refer to something that we can do in game. I assume that Ultimate Shadow with Blood Wave similarly leaves behind Desecrated Ground. It's any area of effect shadow damage over time ability that the Necromancer has. And if I'm reading this correctly, the bonus goes up to 590 damage? That seems wrong, but also I don't know how else to interpret this. The cool part is that if you're also standing in Desecrated Ground, so I think Blight, Shadow Wave, and Corpse Explosion, you're going to deal a 1.15 multiplier to shadow damage. So this thing right here also seems pretty wildly powerful. Again, they can kind of get away with doing this because shadow damage over time can't crit, but it still can benefit from vulnerable. So maybe a lot of our Infinimist and basic shadow builds that aren't Sever are probably going to skip building into crit damage as a whole only really build into the vulnerable proc and maybe some vulnerable damage, but instead just look to super ramp up our shadow damage and shadow damage over time to benefit from all these huge bonuses that they're showing on these glyphs, because these numbers are pretty ridiculous. But there you have it. There's a breakdown of all of the new aspects, all of the new uniques, and all of the new glyphs coming to the Necromancer. These things have a lot of potential to shift up quite a bit of the meta. We need to see the stats on a lot of these unique items, and then also get our hands on these aspects and really play around with the ones that are completely new to get a better understanding of exactly how they're going to impact everything. But if this helped you in any way, shape, or form, please consider liking the video, throwing a subscription down on the channel if you want more of this content to this level of detail. I know it's a lot, but I try to give you every single thing that my brain is thinking about when I'm looking through these changes and I'm trying to theorycraft and imagine. So I truly hope that it helps. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.